Hey guys, welcome back to the Dr. Catafit podcast. Welcome if you're new. If you're looking at this on the YouTube video, I have some nice little pops here to see. If you're listening on YouTube podcast today, our episode would be talking about worms, GI parasite, worm infection in dogs. Now, when I say worms, I'm not speaking about earthworms or maggots, which would be fly larvae. I'm talking about GI parasites are worms that live in the gut usually of dogs. Today we're talking about dogs. This is the Dog Doctor podcast. But other animals can get worms as well, and dog worms can sometimes go from dogs to cats to humans to other animals. But in general, we're speaking about worms found in the intestinal tracts of dogs. We already spoken about heartworms, and heartworms would be a worm found in the heart. Canine heartworm, therefore imitis. And we're going to talk about worms now. Worms get the name because, of course, they're little wormy creatures. The entire life they would be a worm. So the difference with a worm and a maggot, for instance, a maggot might be a worm like today, but then becomes a pupa and then turns into a fly. Whereas in GI parasite, it would be a worm larva look like a worm, a middle stage look like a worm, and then the adult would also look like a worm. So then it's worms. So, what are worms? Worms are classified as endoparasites. They're parasites that usually live in an animal. I'll get to the scientific side of things. How do you recognize if your dog have worms? Someone may say, "Hey, doc, I think my dog have worms." Especially in puppies, worms would be in their gut in some different part of the GI tract. Some live in the small intestine, some live in the large intestine, some would live in the rectum. But in general, you would see a poor looking puppy with really shabby skin. Sometimes it has what you call a pot belly or a wormy gut. If you were to listen to its gut at this point in time, sometimes you hear a lot of gut tone, like and gut noises, because the worms are actually living inside of the intestines. Some may survive by actually competing for food, while others may be sucking blood, like hookworms, for instance, would suck blood off the intestinal worms, whereas roundworms, which is the common spaghetti looking one, might be competing for food and taking some of the vitamins out of there. Or we also have tapeworms, which are long tapeworms, may also be sucking on the dog or taking some food out of the guts. So basically, internal parasite or endoparasite, which normally would be considered regular as worms, compete with the animal for nutrition. So if your dog have worms like this puppy there, the food it eats, instead of getting all the energy from the food, there is a parasite in it which will also be taking some of that energy away. And in some cases, puppies can have worms so bad that they do not grow. They get stunted growth. They get really poor coat. They even may die. Now, GI parasite, yes, heavy worm burden can lead to death. So to get a bit scientific for a while, we have different orders and classes. So worms would be in the phylum nematode. The nematodes are the roundworms. Most of these would be like heartworms, hookworms, roundworms, pinworms, strangiles, not all the type of worms in the roundworms. So they're long and cylindrical, kind of like a spaghetti when you think of it. Um, that would be the nematodes. You also have cestodes, which is segmented worms like the tapeworms. Now, this comes in important later on. You also have another type you might have called the flatworms or from the phylum Platyhelminths. That'll be more like your liver fluke and those things too. They were not talking about flatworms. We're talking about nematodes and cestodes because those are the common worms that would come across in domestic animals. Well, for say dog. Now, if you haven't heard of the term zoonotic before, and as we've spoken about heartworm, if you haven't seen the heartworm, listen to the heartworm podcast. You can go and have a listen. Whereas canine heartworm would not normally affect a human, canine hookworms and canine ringworms would definitely infect a human. So if you're around there, a lot of dogs and they're not dewormed, they look like they have a heavy worm burden, you should probably consider deworming yourself. As a veterinarian, I would probably deworm myself 3 to 4 times a year because I could be susceptible to a hookworm or a roundworm infection from my dog. Some types of tapeworms would also be zoonotic and can infect a human from the animal. More like if you're pregnant, you're a pregnant lady, you may not want to play with a house cat. Huh? But that's a different story. Today we're talking about common worms, how to identify it, how to treat it, what do they do. So to diagnose if your dog have worms, you could use experience, but definitive diagnosis is to do a fecal exam. You take the feces from your dog, you look under a microscope with a specific like a process, and you would either see the egg of the worm or a larva of the worm based on what species it is. Because some larvae mutate. Now, most GI parasite or worms, they reproduce by what you call a fecal oral transmission. Because they live in the gut, they would lay the egg, which goes out in the feces, mutate into a larva. It actually is a funny thing, and I'll give you a story. If you're from the Caribbean, you would know that whenever a dog goes and eat grass, they'll be like, "Oh, eating grass, he has worms," and that he's eating the grass to um to get rid of the worms. But the funny thing, the worms want to live too. Everything want to live. So the worm larvae would come out the feces, turn to a stage one larva, climb up this strain of grass, stay on the top and get dehydrated, where it waits for a dog to eat this strain of grass. When the dog eat the grass because the adult worms are tickling it in its intestines, the grass would actually reinfect it with the larva. So now he has an infected dog because it ate the grass. It ate an active worm larva. So it's fecal oral. It normally comes, it lay the eggs out in the feces, mutate into a larva. The larva come back through the mouth, whether through food that may drop on the ground, whether through eating a strain of grass. Different one maybe differently. There are a few variations to that and a few differences. Like hookworms, for instance, have what you call cutaneous larva migrant, whereby cat hookworms especially, more than dog, which would have laid the egg in the sand, and then the larva would be there, and a human or a dog would walk in the sand, and on contact with the skin, which is cutaneous, the larva would burrow itself below the skin, maybe through a pore, and move until it gets to where it wants to be. So it's cutaneous larva migrants because you may see a line on your foot. That can happen to humans who play volleyball a lot because cats would probably use the sandpit as a big litter box. And you would see a red line up your foot every day, and it's cutaneous larva migrant because it migrates under the skin. Just the same roundworms, for instance, might have what you call visceral larva migrants. They would move through the organs or the viscera until they find the GI tract. Now, that's just something to know. But if you deworm your animal with an adequate dewormer at relatively recommended intervals, you could avoid all of this. Another way of transmission besides fecal oral, you have hookworms and roundworms, which are the two most common worm affecting dogs through basically our life cycle. But in younger dogs and pup, you have what you call transplacenta transmission. So the mother dog is pregnant, it's not dewormed adequately. It has a roundworm or a hookworm infection. The actual roundworm or hookworm could also infect the puppies while they're inside of the mother. Just the same, you also have a transmammary infection whereby while the mother of the puppies are infected, she's making the milk, she's lactating. The actual worm larva could move through the mammary gland in the milk and infect the puppy. So that's why it's always recommended with a good deworming protocol if you have a mother dog with lactating pups. You also have direct transmission where some type of worm would actually infect the dog without leaving the body. So it's like a circulating infection in there. But the common way worm transmission go along would be fecal oral. So the common things happen commonly is the most way to get it. So somehow contaminated feces would get back ingested back into the animal and the cycle continues. Just some worms may be what you call self-replicating, like tapeworms would let go a segment with hundreds of eggs and they keep releasing a segment because tapeworms are segmented worms or cestodes, right? Other nematodes may just lay eggs, so they may have male version as well as female version of this worm. Um, Again, as a veterinarian, we treat worms all the time. So the other thing I would like to bring up here now, treatment. So different type of worms have you should imagine would have a different treatment requirement. So there may be worms that are medication that are species specific. So if your dog have tapeworms, for instance, and you use a wrong worm medication, it will not get rid of the tapeworms. So for on the market right now, praziquantel would be the go-to drug for getting rid of tapeworms. Tapeworms usually you see small rice grain segments moving in the feces, and that's how you can diagnose tapeworms actually before actually going under the microscope. You see a little thing like rice grain moving in the feces or on the bum of your dog or cat, and then you know, okay, my dog has tapeworms because the segments from this segmented worm would come out in the feces. If you have a hookworm transmission, for instance, because hookworm actually are very small, easier to see under a microscope than with your bare eyes. Tapeworm you see with your bare eyes, roundworm you see with your bare eyes, but hookworms are smaller. Um, when hookworm move a lot, they attach to the body wall. They suck the blood actually off your dog, and when they move, they would leave a bloody tinge. So you may see blood tinged feces, just a slight streak of blood on the feces, and you say, "Hey, my dog probably has a hookworm infection." So you can go do a fecal exam and you look for the eggs of the hookworm in that feces. Hookworm, for instance, parental would be the treatment of choice for hookworms. So you may use a common dewormer. It's not parental. Your dog has hookworms. It will still have hookworm after you deworm it. So not just any deworming would get rid of worms. You need specific medication that's going to treat the specific worm that your dog may have. A lot of people would say, I dewormed my dog last week. How can you tell me it still have worms? And you look at what they gave the dog only to realize that they used a wrong one medication, for instance, to treat hookworms or tapeworms. So now that you know different types of worms have a different way of infecting your animal and a different life cycle, but different medication as well would be needed to treat them. So now that we get past that, we want to get into something a little bit more modern and interesting. You know, with all that considered, you now have what you call antimicrobial resistance, or the worm is there. This medication could have treated it for the last 50 years. Now it no longer works. So you have the worms are mutating. Remember, everybody wants to live. And even though the worm is a parasite, it also wants to live. So medication that may have worked many years ago don't work now. As a result, as you may have heard me speak about that with the heartworm issue, where you still use ivermectin to get rid of heartworms. But and you would use farbendazole. Farbendazole or fenbental would have been one of the most common deworming used, and everybody use it in the Panaccio, the Hunter 10, Fenbendazole 10%. And right now, if you don't use it properly or you use it, it doesn't work as it used to. So it's really good for roundworms. To combat this antimicrobial resistance and worm resistance, one of the things we're doing now is combination medication. So the product I use, and I stand behind it 100%, would be a combination of three different dewormers: Fabental or fenbendazole, pyrental, and praziquantel. And when I use this, I would normally use it with an injectable or another modality or different type of medication to treat heartworms. So when you combine these four things, you get rid of heartworms, lungworms, roundworms, hookworms, pinworms, tapeworms, all worms. And it's a complete deworming, and that's where you know that you're not leaving something back to develop resistance. Uh, we didn't speak of it here. Based on where you are in the world, you may have other worms as well. You may have long worms if you're in the UK, and those temperate regions have long worms. Long worms are literally like worms from the intestine tract, but they live in the lungs. Just as heartworms would live in the heart. Fenbendazole is a really good treatment for long worms. Probably 1 gram of fenbendazole every day for 7 days. It depends on the size of your dog. But in areas with long worms, and your dog actually get long worms from eating slugs, so the wrong worms would lay they live in the lungs, come up to your throat. It would lay the eggs. The dog start coughing a little bit. It swallows that ingesta, pass through the GI tract, comes out in the feces. The slug would go eat that. Snails and slugs go eat the feces, of course. It mutates inside of there. The dog see the slug eat it. It reinfects itself, and that larva now go from the GI tract back to the lungs. The infection continues again. That's how lungworms work. Just to talk here, remember how heartworms was? The heartworm lives in the heart, make a live young. Mosquito bite the dog, it mutates. Mosquito bite another dog, it transmit it. So there's lots of vectors that may use to transmit worms. In some cases, with some tapeworms, actually, the flea is a vector for some of the tapeworms. So that's a different story. That's not today. We can't cover everything today, but we're going to talk about the basics. So you're listening to the Dr. Carter Dog Doctor podcast. Today we're talking about worms or GI parasite. How do you know if your dog have worms? If it's a little puppy, it's eating food, it's failing to thrive, it has a pot belly appearance, probably groaning every time in the evening, it probably has worms. If it's an adult dog and it's just poor doing, it's like a 6 to 12 month old puppy. It's poor doing, you've been feeling it a lot. He looks dead, and when it passes feces, you see blood tinging the feces every week or so. It probably has hookworms, yeah. If it's also an adult dog and you see it walking around and there's a little piece of rice grain hanging out on the floor by his bum, it's probably a tapeworm infection. Or you see like a rice grain moving in the feces, yep, your dog definitely have a tapeworm infection. Pinworm is also another one. Humans has pinworm as well. And pinworm lives just around the rectum. It comes out in the night and it tickles the anus. And it lays its like egg out there. So you see like a white crusty paste around the anus in the morning. And then what does the dog do? It licks it out. Bam, fecal oral transmission. It goes back again. There's lots of different ones. There's also some really cool worms. Like there's one. There's okay, really cool for the pathologist and the vet, not for the dog. There's like Trichuris vulpris. There's some really nice name one as well. There is there's one that lives in the neck or in the esophagus, man. It's really cool. When you follow the life cycle of these worms. But in other animals as well would have worms. Not every time can a dog worm, for instance, infect your sheep or your cattle worm infect your cat. But some would be zoonotic, some would be species specific, which means this would only have infect dogs, this would only infect cats, this might only infect sheep or goat, while some might be general across the board, whereby like a cat worm, a dog worm one would infect a human. Now, here is some of the bad things, the bad side of things here. If you're really close with your pet, for instance, your pet dog and your dog may have wrongworms or hookworms. Those can infect you. The larva, hookworm larva can become a cutaneous larva migrant in a human, a visceral larva migrant in a human. Um, We'll get to the pig ones later on a different podcast where you might have cyst encysted worm larvae in some part of the meat, and if you don't cook the meat properly and you eat that, you can also be infected and get encyst. And cyst may go to your brain, may go other places. You also have visceral larva migrants with wrong worms in humans. We may end up in your eyes. There are children with worms in their eyes. Even might get to your brain, cause a stroke, may get to your heart, may block an artery. So you need to be careful. If you're going to be interacting with animals a lot, especially dogs and cats, and they're close, they're part of your family, make sure you have them on a really good flea and tick preventative. Make sure you have them on a really good deworming protocol because that is not only good for their health, but it's also good for your health. But yep, we don't want to talk too long today. Leave a couple comments. Come on the YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast, go on the YouTube channel, look for the same podcast video. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about this. If you have any questions, we have a lot of following up we can do with GI parasites, when to do what, how to treat. I'll give you a little basic now before we end this podcast, how I will treat a dog. So if I'm looking at a dog from pregnancy, I would probably deworm the dam. The mother dog would be the dam before she mated. And then I will wait till she's 6 weeks pregnant because a dog would only take 8 weeks to give birth. Cat, the same thing. Cats are a bit more frantic. So I would deworm the dog when she's 6 weeks pregnant. That's just to cover hookworms, maybe some tapeworms. I'm not really worried about tapeworms at that stage. She's probably already on a heartworm preventative. I'm worried about the wrongworms and hookworms because they can have what you call transplacenta transmission from the mother to the pup while it's still inside. Then the next day I will deworm this dog would be on the day she gives birth, which would be 8 weeks. And that way now I'm going to cover the hookworm every 2 weeks because what hookworms can do, although they live in the GI tract and they drink blood off the intestine wall, they would go into the muscles. So if you kill all those in the GI tract now, by 2 weeks later there would be new ones coming down from the muscles. So you treat it every 2 weeks for full treatment, and that should get rid of a hookworm infection in the body. So at the day she gives birth, or the day of whelping, I would deworm her again. That would be 2 weeks from the last treatment, just to cover all the wrongworms, hookworms. I would protect the puppies. Now, if you're a dog breeder, you can go listen to the dog breeder podcast. If you're not a dog breeder, you can listen to it just for the educational benefit. But I deworm it then. After that, I will deworm the mother again when the pups are 2 weeks old. So that'll be her third deworming because I did it when she was 6 weeks pregnant, 8 weeks pregnant. The pups are now 2 weeks. And I would deworm the puppies, make sure it has parental in there. At 4 weeks old would be the first deworming, and as well as the mother would get her last deworming at 4 weeks old. Now, most people would be advised to already start creep feeding the puppy at around 4 weeks, 5 weeks, wean it from the mother at 5 weeks old. So by the time 6 weeks old, the puppies get their second dose of deworming and they get their first vaccine somewhere around 6 to 8 weeks. But we're talking about vaccines in a different podcast. After that, you'll probably see the pups every 3 weeks or so, and they can be dewormed there. and then it would be advised as to what's a good protocol. This may also be a geographic issue based on where you're located. They would have different types of worms there who have to be treated and prevented differently. That's understandable. Um, but for in general, if you go with those timelines and you use the right set of products to target the worms you're trying to keep away from or keep out of your animals, you would be safe, you'd be good. As for adult dogs, I deworm with an annual visit. I will deworm the animal, give them a complete deworming with every annual visit. Adult dogs, any dog over 6 months, really, it's if it's getting a good plain of nutrition, you're feeding it well, it's healthy, it's an heartworm preventative. GI parasite is not really an issue, but it can also happen. So it may be periodic deworming. I would say maybe every 3 to 4 months. So there's some people I would deworm their dog every 3 to 4 months when I use flea and tick preventative. I use a 3 month product. So on the 3 month visit, they would get a checkup, a deworming, flea and tick preventative, an injection for the heartworms. I have a 3 month heartworm injection as well. And then boom, I don't have to see them again for another 3 months, but I know they're protected during this period. Some other veterinarians would have different protocols. Again, it will be based on what you're exposed to in your location as well as what you want to prevent. Geography is a big thing, but in general, worms would affect dogs everywhere you go in the world. And the way to diagnose it would be to take a fecal sample most times, look for the worm eggs there, and there will be loads of charts and guidelines as to what egg would be what. The way to treat it would vary based on where you are and what you have access to. There's some medication now that there's a bit of resistance to. You may have to increase the dose a bit. So know what's the tolerant dose for this medication. Some else you may have to do combination medication. Know what also you can use to combine. Another thing people would do in the farm animal side of things, which would get its own podcast, but they would say, okay, well, this time I use Panacur, but next time I'm using Hunter 10. And then if you don't know Panacur 10% and Hunter 10, they're both fenbendazole 10%. And then they use it one day and they don't use it another day. And fenbendazole in dogs for GI parasite will probably have to use 3 days in a row in succession, 3 days in succession, the same dose. Or they would say, well, I give it a half a dose because it's kind of small. And by doing these things, one, you don't get rid of the worms. Two, you increase the chances of developing antimicrobial resistance. So, if you want a person that practice that, don't practice that. Have a talk with your veterinarian. If your veterinarian is competent enough, they will know that. Some veterinarian may not be exposed to GI parasite enough to give you a proper explanation. You can also reach out, leave something in the comment, but I guarantee you, the average veterinarian is competent enough to tell you what we deworm against, what we use, and why we use it. And what you would have to worry about. Remember, if you're a woman, you're thinking about getting pregnant, you're pregnant, try not to change the cat litter box, okay? Even if you have an indoor only cat, try not to change the cat litter box. Other than that, you should be fine. Take a deworming periodically if you have an animal in your life. Me as a veterinarian, I have to deworm myself maybe every 3 to 4 months just for safety because I'm definitely going to be exposed to parasite on a daily basis. Again, this one is about a little just over 20 minutes. I don't want to stay too long. We're definitely going to have some follow ups on the deworming section of things on the Dog Doctor podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't on the YouTube side, on the podcast side. Just enjoy it. Look out for the next episode next Monday. Have a good one.